Also, you're always welcome back. So, Jeremy, you may want to stick around because a very good friend of mine is the next speaker now. And Stewart, are you there? Let me just make
Sure.
sure you have superpowers. Uh,
Superpowers should be on. Are they working? Can you hear
yes,
me?
superpowers are now on your co-host.
Great.
And so I met Stewart. Interestingly, we randomly bumped into each other in Mallorca in the first and last Smart Island Summit because he was working for the Rockefeller Foundation back then in the Pacific Islands. I think Marshall Islands was the bigger project, but he had quite a few more in the Pacific and beyond. And I am a smart cities expert with the United Nations, so our conversation started there. And 4 years later, here we are. So thank you so much for joining, and I'm thrilled to hear what you have to say. So please go ahead and flood us with your wisdom.
I hope it's the right kind of flood. So thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I was just recounting with uh, another person we met there this morning, one of our Greek friends, about that experience and what it started. And the personal relationships are, in some ways, the most important legacy of those Smart Island Congresses and that work. So really appreciate that we're still in touch and having these conversations. And I think also it also is why I was happy to sit and have this conversation around the work that you're doing and how it relates. Because again, it's about the people. It's especially about the people for me and the work that I'm doing. And basically, my topic today is around resilience and recovery and thinking about the work that may offer wisdom, but I think is also great for just a discussion. Um, and as I thought about this, wherever people may be sitting, some of the materials or the founding materials or language inside the Neoway program talks about the definition of wisdom and also notes that, and I think the quote is that doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. And in many ways, my experience that led me to the work I'm doing now centers around that. And even for this short time together, obviously we can't discuss all the ins and outs and definitions of resilience, but thinking about doing the right thing at the right time for the right reasons um, struck me as something that made my experience and the conversations around resilience and recovery so relevant, because that in fact inside those definitions are the way that we hope that people will consider this work. So as I kind of do the storytelling, we'll get into that a little bit more in my background and why I ended up where I am. But not knowing anyone but Marcelo, I'd love to have, if possible, throw into the chat um, your name and where you are right this moment. I know some of us have gone back to places, been stuck in places. I myself have been stuck without travel, which is brutal for me, in the Washington D.C. area for the last 7 months. But if you would just throw your name and where you're located into the chat, but also give me your sort of one line, if you can use the chat, one line version of what resilience means to you or what your definition of resilience is. I always like to hear where we're starting and what people think of resilience, how they view it, because obviously there's not one definition. There's a common one that I've been using in all of my work, and that started with some of the ways that Marcelo and I ran into each other. But as I dive in here a little bit, feel free to throw your name and your location and anything you feel or define resilience by into the chat, and we'll come around. We'll come around to that. So um, the story that led me to this point, and what I think of as resilience, and what I've been using in my work, really revolves around the capacity to kind of survive, thrive, and grow. And that's why the Neo way wisdom definition struck me so much, because the idea is that we are having the capacity and building the capacity to survive, thrive, and grow. And that's no matter what the shocks and stresses are. So we all have been experiencing a shock, one that we would have defined as a shock in terms of the pandemic. But that has led to cascading shocks and stresses globally. It's certainly something that as a globe, in a rare occasion, we as humans have experienced this global storm at the same time. In the work that I've done in the past, sometimes we're talking about cyclones or hurricanes or specific shocks that are very regionally located, whether they're man-made or natural. And the relevance to the conversation is that we are now in a kind of global storm, and a lot of shocks and stresses that were there previously are exacerbated by the pandemic shock. And we've seen that around the globe. And of course, sitting in the United States, because I can't leave, we are particularly aware of like how the shocks and stresses came together, and what that might mean as we work together, and what that means for our way of building more resilience. So I see a few of the chats coming up, and great mix. And we see some of the common language, this withstanding, and the recovery aspect, and that's kind of how I got into it. And the way that I got into it, and what I wanted to share today and have a discussion about, is that I had been doing so much work on recovery, both in terms of direct work experience, but also in terms of kind of creative documentary. So there's kind of two pieces that brought me to this. And it's been, really a couple of decades of work in indigenous communities, in cities, and on islands, including some ocean work. So I wish I'd heard the previous discussion, because that would have probably tied in well here. And so for me, because we define this resilience aspect as very holistic, it allows us to talk about different parts of our economy, different parts of our society, in particular for teenagers who are sort of looking ahead. How can we be more resilient? How do we build resilience? How do we have this pre-recovery mindset? And for me, it became super apparent working with indigenous communities who defined resilience in a way that was much more tied to survival and being able to get through, for obvious reasons that start with hundreds of years of colonialism, but also present conditions that tend to make people in some ways, and by some definitions, more resilient. And you can see a little bit of that language in what you're putting into the chat. And then what started happening is there were so many conversations about recovery again and again and again, that by the time I transitioned to some post-hurricane work that both involved cities and indigenous communities, and then when I came to work for the federal government and served on the hurricane task force for Hurricane Sandy, it was pretty clear to me that we were continuing to have recovery conversations way too often, again and again and again and again. And that's why the idea of resilience really struck me, even though the definitions are different sometimes. Sometimes it's about survival, but like many of the definitions you're sticking in, it's this ability to be more resilient and to, in our case, as we define it, survive and thrive and grow. That's very different than just getting through a disaster or surviving something that's happened to you. One of my earliest resilience definition moments was with a group of tribal elders and living on the reservation and working on community development finance, and kind of like nation building or economic sovereignty work. And we were talking about sustainability versus resilience. And some of the elders, and one in particular, said, we've been in survival mode, we've been in recovery mode for 400 years. So the idea that we're preparing for something to hit us has always been the case because there's been instability for this long. It was also a little bit of a rebuke to say, we just want to get the basics of our economy and our society returned. All of these like sort of higher level conversations about really building resilience and looking towards the future, at that moment, and this is going back now 15 years, seemed very advanced. Like, why don't we just talk about our single bottom line before we talk about triple bottom lines and sustainability and resilience? So it was a good moment and a good sort of stepping back to say, the idea of resilience can take many forms, but that also there are places where that survival tends to be the framework that people are working in. So this has been very true in my work on islands. As Marcelo noted, I've been working in the Pacific, but also in the Caribbean. And as part of a group that's based in France, I'm also working on very small islands and their overall sustainability and resilience. And those it's an organization called SMILO. And in those cases, much like the indigenous populations, you have a very small group where everything is interconnected. It makes resilience easier to talk about, but it also means that if something goes wrong, there's these cascading effects that can also be worse if you're not set up ahead of time. So it was these work experiences, these constant conversations about recovery that pushed me further into the space. But also as a photographer, I kept documenting places and people and the moments and the transitions that were happening. And in one particular project that's still ongoing in Newfoundland on fishing villages that are roadless and are being closed down, you also see the big shocks and the big stresses from things like climate change, and you combine that with things like we're experiencing right now just in the last 7 months with the pandemic. And it really starts to kind of reawaken this idea that if we're going to be resilient, if we're going to have a pre-recovery mindset, we have to be much more holistic about it. So that made, on the one hand, the visual storytelling more important, and having ongoing conversations like this with adults and youth, including my own. I try to get my 14-year-old to sort of listen into this, but he pointed out that he hears it all the time. So he chose to skip this particular session. But the idea that as we talk about looking forward, and we've all had a wake-up call in the last 6-7 months, that we're so interconnected globally, both from the storytelling standpoint, but also from the sort of implementation and the effects of shocks and stresses that we experience. So I've spent especially the last 5 to 10 years, working with partners and funders and local communities, big cities, small cities, indigenous communities, island communities, and the overlapping areas, especially on islands with the ocean communities and where fisheries meet sustainability around tourism, which hit things like the adaptation we need to do for coral health, which very much affect economies, especially when those island economies have a GDP that's based on 80% of it's based on tourism. And so when you have a hurricane hit and you have COVID, what happens if that's what the economy is based on? So like many of the comments that you've made about resilience, and even in some of the locations that you are, we've felt that pullback on the economics, which has then these cascading effects. So there's sort of two pieces that put me on this path, and that for the communities that I look at, the communities that I'm working with, these are so intertwined, and it isn't just about one factor, which I'm sure you had in this ocean conversation just before this. So especially because it's a small group, I want to make sure that we can have a conversation, and I don't know how these have been set up previously, but I would love to take a moment and see if there's questions about anything I've said so far, and I can delve in a little bit deeper into various aspects. But I'd also just like to make this more of a conversation, especially because it's a pretty small group, and there's about 10 minutes left. I don't know how tight the timekeeping is that Marcelo does, but I'll stop there and see what kind of conversation we can have and what kind of questions we might have, and what we might talk about in the future as we do more of these kinds of things together. So thank you.
Great, and thanks so much for that, Stewart. So the next speaker, Jamie, is already here, and in principle he should start now. But Jamie, if you're cool with pushing it back by 10 minutes, I think we could continue the conversation with Stewart. Can you confirm that you're okay with that?
I'm super green, no problem.
Oh, fantastic. So guys, please go ahead, because Stewart has a fascinating life. He's been to incredibly unique places around the world. So if you ever wanted to travel through his eyes, this is a good opportunity to ask what he's seen and what he's learned. It's a vicarious travel, right?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I'm doing the vicarious travel for the last 7 months. So also interested in other people's conversations from where they are and what they've seen. But yeah, I mean, I'm completely lucky that all the places I've worked, I've been able to kind of fuse these together in somewhat of a common narrative, although every place is different, of course. So happy to take questions or just have a conversation and hear from you.
Well, actually, I don't have a question, but a comment on the term resilience. Actually, in the term resilience, I did some little research before answering my question you asked before, and actually, it's one I can just read one definition I found. It's being able to withstand or recover, and I think the two terms are not similar to me. Well, withstand is something which has a perspective. That means you are ready for some issue or some problem you will encounter, and recover is like when you're sick, your body recovers, and it's something like rather passive. Of course, you can help with medicines or advice from a doctor, but I like the part of withstand of something which may occur to you. And of course, we have big issues coming for the humanity, like climate change or many others as well, or like the virus now, the pandemic now. And I think thinking about resilience in terms of being able to withstand or to being prepared or to think about how to deal with upcoming threats or issues. And actually, I'm interested in how you address this part of the resilience, like the withstand. How you manage that when you talk to indigenous people, when you encounter whatever crisis, or how you address this part of the resilience. How do you deal with it?
Yeah, it is. You can imagine, especially because, and I'm old enough and have gone through this growth, that we didn't really use the word resilience in the way that we're using it now, and we certainly didn't use it as much as we're using it now. What's ironic is that I have neighbors and friends and family who didn't really understand what I did, and when COVID came, they were like, "Ah, right, everything's interconnected. Now we kind of understand what you mean." And I was like, "Oh, thank God." Terrible reason, right, for people to understand it,
Right.
because it does get to your question, right? What our definition and the work that we've been doing. So on the city side, we've been establishing chief resilience officers for cities all over the world. And their job, along with us, is to do exactly what you said, which is to talk about the preparation and withstanding, but to also talk about all the interconnectedness, from city budgets to NGOs in the community to neighborhoods to, what are those shocks and stresses. So some of the first things that we did in cities, on islands, in the indigenous communities, is to sort of take an inventory. What are your shocks and what are your stresses? What are the primary shocks and stresses? And then together, what would we do if we built a strategy to be better able to withstand? And there was a long argument. I think the argument's still there. Is resilience a process or is it a state? And for us, we didn't care whether it was either of those, right? And if you think about how we might talk to youth about this, if you're acting in a resilient way and you're planning, and so it's looking towards a state of mind, but you're also living in that fashion, it can be process and goal at the same time, right? Which is a bit strange, and it takes some time to get there. You can imagine that in a city or on an island government, if you place a chief resilience officer in the midst, and that person is saying, you sanitation, you parks, you economic development, you transportation, you all have to speak the same language and you have to work together. That's difficult. And we used to say there will be tears, and there were, because people feel that their silo, that their area, their pillar is the most important. They worry about their budgets, they worry about their work. So I think, this is a very long answer to your question, but it's an ongoing debate, but it's important to have it, because part of what we're hoping to do is to not be in recovery, and so therefore have the pre-recovery mindset. Meanwhile, there are things that we're doing from a green, blue, and gray infrastructure standpoint that are preparatory. 10 years out, 20 years out. Since COVID, there's a lot more discussion about black swan events. I myself have decided that, and this is a bit controversial for someone who works what I do, but I don't really like the term anymore, because in some cases, our chief resilience officers had pandemic as one of their top 5 stresses or shocks, potential shocks, right? So they were already thinking about it. It wasn't a black swan. I call it an ugly duckling that we should learn from, right? And grow from. So for me, it's like, maybe there are things I've said, right? A meteor or an alien invasion might be black swan, but we might be planning for those as well. So not to be too cheeky, but the fact is that if we think more about what could be coming and we're preparing for that, it puts us in a state of mind. And for large cities where everything's very interconnected, but even small communities or islands, that interconnection of planning and preparatory and withstanding what's coming is also part of the core DNA of this work, and not living in pillars, not working in pillars.
Well, I think that's very important, especially if you look ahead and of all the things that may come, not interconnecting with fear. That means, if you have the fear of an alien invasion and the fear of whatever the meteor coming to the earth, and then you just argue or try to build up your strategy built upon this fear. I think this is not the right approach, but of course you have to be aware of the possibility of that and trying to be creatively engaged in a process which may deal with such a black swan, as you mentioned it. But I think, the two states of mind, I think should be separate, because if you think about, how politics works, they try to work with fear, saying, listen, be careful, don't let whatever foreigners in because they might be, so that they work with fear to the population. I think that's not, from my point of view, is not the right strategy or perspective to pursue. But of course, you have to be aware of what the black swan may be and try to address this issue, and in a positive way. That's what I would like to add.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I also think that when people say fear, sometimes I like to turn that into data or storytelling, right? But in a positive way, right? And I think, especially in this day and age with social media and our ability to tell stories so rapidly, sometimes the wrong stories and things that aren't true, but if you think about it, just being prepared without inciting fear can still be a positive experience. And so having good data, telling good stories, making sure that people understand them, because I work in, for a while I was the managing director in Latin America, and I was working heavily in Brazil and Colombia. And then I was working in Europe and the Middle East. And so I spent time in places as different as Tbilisi, Georgia, and Egypt, and Barcelona, right? So the context is always slightly different, but it's amazing how similar the conversations are between the city leaders, between the island leaders, between the chief resilience officers. And this is ongoing work. So basically every day I'm on a WhatsApp that's global and one that's local. And when COVID hit, it was like being on CRO, Chief Resilience Officer, COVID TV. It was like a constant flow of real-time conversations. And in some cases, they were much better prepared because they had resilience strategies and they'd been thinking about this. Whatever the shock was, they'd been thinking about it. Other questions or thoughts? I don't want to take up too much more of the time, but it's been.
I guess I have one is, how long do you think it'll be before we forget this particular event and it no longer becomes something we become resilient for? And yet again, it becomes a black swan because our political memory is, well, to say the least, very short. Actually, goldfish wonder why our political memory is so short.
Yeah, no, it's true. You know, I'm reminded of everything that suddenly everybody remembered about the 1918 influenza, right? Like in the plague, and going back even further, right? Suddenly, people were digging up documents and photography of people in masks and talking about schools that were held outside, as if as if there was some like lightning bolt of information that suddenly had appeared, although that was all there. And I think part of and that's a difficult question for me, because as a storyteller and photographer, but also somebody who's working on the ground to try to prepare, I do think that different than a hurricane, and also different than a more localized influenza or flu, this has had a deeper, wider effect, right? Like I've called it a global storm in this conversation, but so I'm hopeful that it lasts more, and it has a more resounding effect on the factors of resilience and what people want to build up. I agree with you that governments and people have short memories. Humans have short memories. And so the job of the data person, the storyteller, the historian, etc., to be there, the scientist, is even more important, because obviously we all experienced this at the same time, and we were literally watching people, sing to each other off of balconies in Italy, before things even happened in other parts of the world. So that's the one thing that gives me a bit of hope, is that we are so visually, physically, visually connected, even if we're physically apart. But it is a danger, right, that we forget this one because something else comes along.
And I think one of the other things that I've seen is that, as kind of someone with a scientific background, I've always seen, I know what the scientific process is. It's something that's very iterative. It takes quite a bit of time. And usually it's done in the background. Nobody sees it. They see the end result. They see their iPhone. They can get their GPS location. They can navigate their car. All of this stuff, which is the end result of the process. But this is really the first time we've had to see the scientific process in real time.
Yep.
Told to us by people who don't understand, i.e. the news media, or people who want to take advantage of specific things. And I think this is one thing I hope we really learn from is, science is not an exact, it's not something that, you just put the inputs in and 2 minutes later we have the result, right?
That's right. That's right. And it's also sticky for people who don't know the scientific process, because it looks like it's iterative. And because it's iterative, if you're not comfortable with that iteration, which the general public is not, and it's not used to, because they, once they've decided they want an answer, it has to be, yeah, they want it now, and it has to be black and white, and it can't be, changeable. And the great thing about the scientific process is it's like theory, test, theory, test, theory, test, and we begin to know, right, whether it's a vaccine or it's, new building materials. So that is amazing and frightening about this whole process the last 7 months, is that misinterpretations and misunderstandings about the scientific process, but also what like facts are versus non-facts.
Well, I think scientists now have to realize that if it's something big, everything they do is exactly similar to what someone in Hollywood goes through when someone sees them with someone who isn't their assumed partner. I mean, they have to be very mindful of not just what they're doing, but how what they're doing will be interpreted, even if it's an interim step or it's the first step, or they get to the end and they say, well, this was inconclusive, but it at least gives us a shot to go left or right or continue straight ahead.
Yep.
You have to be careful because people are going to look at every word, not understand what the words are, but think they understand one, and then use that to go out onto our wonderful internet and try to convince people something which probably is not right.
No, that's correct. And someone who has a very mixed academic and experiential background, you know, I do things like listen to epidemiology podcasts, and I nerd out on those because I listen to it. I listen to the debate even amongst the epidemiologists, right? That's very different than watching mainstream media talking heads, right? So the canyon is wide between those.
Yeah, no. Cool, thanks. Very interesting.
That was a great discussion. Thanks a lot, Stuart. That's a really good material. And
real pleasure, and hope to come back and we can do, you know, bigger sessions and combine people. It's a fascinating platform you set up, Marcelo. Thanks very much.
Still can't believe that we haven't met when I was in DC at an Explorers Club Cosmo lunch. It was a very enjoyable time.
I know. I really should have been there with you so that I could get myself into the mode that you're in the Explorers Club. You know, and especially ironic now that I've not traveled for 7 months, and you know, despite all the good work still going on, my heart's a bit broken that I'm not out doing my field work.